I sent out a letter and an email to every sheriff's department in the state. Actually, 2 emails and 1 letter. I got 1 response. Now, we got 100 counties, so I got a response from 1. That's not bad. You know, odds like that, if I could get a lottery ticket, I'd buy one. You know, 1 out of 100, that's not too bad. Unfortunately, the 1 response was no. You need to go back and talk to your county sheriffs. I think they're getting bad information. I really do. I do not think they understand who we are, what we represent, or how we can help them in times of crisis. We are not the radical right wing of the Tea Party. We're not, if you are familiar with Ferguson and what took place in Ferguson, they were going around to the rioters and telling them, those guys on top of those buildings that are helping protect those buildings, they're KKK members. Farthest from the truth. We have an information problem right now. So we need to get the word out. You can send letters to your sheriff. That won't do a lot of good. You can send them emails. That's probably being screened by somebody who's paid to field all their emails. That's fine, but they're probably not going to really get much out of that. You need to find them at a local diner, at your church, wherever you might associate with your county sheriff, and just walk up and say, hey, I want to talk to you about Oath Keepers. Hand them a brochure. If you need more information, call me. My number is plastered on every one of these, which might be a mistake. If you call me after 10 o'clock at night, I need to hear an ambulance in the background. I'll help you out. But anyway, get the word out. We are not a subversive organization. I was told that some of the sheriffs have been told they should never associate with anarchist-type organizations. Well, I agree, they shouldn't. But we're not anarchists. That's the farthest thing from the truth. We don't want to be associated with anarchists. That's a bad place to be. So anyway, I'd appreciate it. I can't do it by myself, but if each of you go back and talk to your county sheriff and some of the deputies, word will spread and we'll get our message out. Okay, so we've talked about law enforcement, and we thank you for your service. Appreciate you being here, and it takes a lot of courage to be here, because I'm sure some of you have been told, don't go out there and hang out with those crazy people. How many of you are Army, former Army or active Army? Thank you very much. Air Force. Both of us. Okay, all right. Marines. Really? I can't hear the Marines? There you go. Okay, I know. There's Marines there. And how about Navy? Okay. Let you off the ship, did they? Good deal. We got one more Navy vet I want to introduce you to. He's a Navy veteran, pastor, and husband of KrisAnne Hall. That's a job, man. Where's he at? JC, where are you at? There he is. Please welcome JC Hall.
All right. Appreciate everybody turning out today. I'm going to have to agree with Wild Bill rather than my wife. It's difficult for me to preach a sermon where I talk about liberals and not use the word idiot. Amen. We all know America's not perfect, but how many still believe America is an exceptional nation? Well, this month, 240 years ago, a preacher opened up his church in Richmond, Virginia. And in his church, over 100 leaders gathered, including George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, to listen to a fiery attorney in the church tell them that Americans had begged and petitioned long enough, and it was time to stand up and fight for liberty, that their fellow Americans were already in the streets fighting as he spoke. And from the pulpit of this church, as the preacher amened him from the pew, this fiery lawyer passionately declared, I know not what course other men may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Amen. I wonder what this attorney and those patriots that sat in that church that day would think about the churches of our day. I think one of our brother earlier said we ought to have 4,000 people out here. I think a lot of them ought to be church members and preachers and believers.
Amen.
Ought to be filling this place. But so many in our churches, far from crying enough is enough, sit silently and actually teach believers in the churches that we're supposed to sit and we can't push back, and well, we can pray for the government, but you certainly couldn't disobey a law, and you certainly don't need to be involved in politics. And this poisonous teaching has gotten into the minds of believers and gotten into the minds of so many Americans that the church and believers are practically disengaged from the fight for liberty.
Amen.
And these folks sit with their nose pointed toward the sky, waiting for Jesus to return, while neglecting the very gifts of liberty that He's given them and commanded them to be good stewards of. And I think that is a shame. They sit and falsely teach that Romans 13, where it says that Christians should submit to lawful authority, also includes tyrannical, immoral, and lawless government.
Amen.
Something that was never believed by the church for centuries.
Amen.
Preachers say don't push back, yet in Exodus chapter 1 we see the Hebrew midwives standing up and saying, we will not comply with government mandated abortions.
Amen.
And then God responds and blesses them and commends them. Our preachers today say we can't resist, yet one of their prophets, who by the way was a highly placed politician, you know him by the name of Daniel the prophet. Go check out Daniel chapter 6. He was also Daniel the politician.
Yep.
The king divided the province up into 120 kingdoms, appointed governors over those, and then a 3-man council to govern those, and chief among those was Daniel. Daniel the prophet, Daniel the politician, broke the law and said, I will not comply with this legislative act that these 120 governors had passed and the king stamped. And Daniel said, I will not comply with the law that says I can only worship the king. Daniel threw open his windows. He said, I will not hide my faith from the public square. I'm going to pray 3 times a day out my window so you know who I'm praying to. You can hear who I'm praying to. Yet we have preachers that use the excuse of separation in church and state to tell their parishioners, their congregation that, well, I can't talk about this and you should not either. Whereas our founders put the principle of separation in church and state and sewed it in the First Amendment into our Constitution, which meant government had no business in the church. It did not mean that God had no place in the public square. But these cowardly preachers say that we have to bow down and submit with whatever the government says. Yet the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as the king built an idol and said, you must worship the idol, these 3 young boys said, you know what, we may burn, but we will not bow. Make all the idols you want to, hire all the bands, play all the music you want to, but God is with us, He will fight for us. We may burn, but we will not bow. That's the kind of preachers we need today. And I'm telling you, God was so impressed with them resisting the civil authority with their tyrannical decrees that God in the flesh joined them in the fire.
Amen.
I would like to know how so-called men of God can preach such wicked doctrine. How can we suggest a blind submission, a slavish submission to wicked, tyrannical, immoral, and lawless government?
That's right.
Are we to assume that Martin Luther King Jr., he was the wicked man resisting tyrannical, immoral law? Are they suggesting that Rosa Parks was the bad guy? Are we to believe that all the veterans that poured onto the shores of France fighting an evil, tyrannical government, that they were the bad guys? You know, it used to be some of what Bill mentioned, these old westerns. He reminded me of it. Used to be we'd watch those old westerns and the good guy had the white hat and the bad guy had the black hat. and it was pretty clear who was on the right side. And we got a bunch of preachers in our pulpits that are crippled too high for crutches, apparently, that can't tell the difference between good and evil.
That's right.
I'm here to tell you, folks like Stalin, folks like Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Kim Jong-il, they're amening those wicked sermons from those cowardly preachers. Our God demands that we stand for righteousness. How ironic it is. My wife was teaching the other day in a Christian privately funded library, public lending library. And I walked out and I saw on the shelf this book, and on the front of it, it said, God's Outlaw. And I thought, wow, that's right up my alley. And I opened the book and I said, wow. It was a biography about William Tyndale. And I thought, is this what's called irony? We have preachers all of America standing with their Bibles open, telling people you got to do whatever the government says do because that's what the Bible said. And the very Bible that they hold is based on the work of an outlaw translator.
Amen.
I guess they've never seen Fox's Book of Martyrs that goes throughout this whole tale of people being thrown in the Colosseum, eaten by lions, people being burnt at the stake for the very reason that they resisted tyrannical government and resisted immoral laws. Our entire faith is built upon the righteous resistance of civil authority that has become tyrannical. And we need some preachers to reconnect with their Bible, reconnect with their history, stand up in our pulpits, stop being loyal to your 501c3, stop worshiping money, fear God more than you love your wallet. Stand up and tell people the truth. Are we loving our neighbors as the Lord commanded while our neighbors are being spied upon, while our neighbors are being oppressed, while their emails are being violated, while people are having no-knock raids and warrantless searches? Are we loving our neighbor when innocents are being slaughtered every day? Are we loving our neighbor when wicked government stands and engages in unrighteousness all around us and oppresses our fellow citizens? That, my friend, is not loving your neighbor as yourself. That is wicked. They are the sinners, not the ones resisting evil.
Amen, brother.
Are we loving our neighbor as we stand and say nothing to the suggestion of universal gun registration, which was a prelude in Nazi Germany to the extermination of 6 million Jews? Is that what these preachers would call righteous and loving your neighbor? I say, perhaps preachers should take an oath rather than just giving lip service to the Bible.
That's right, brother.
Perhaps they should stand and swear an oath that they're going to preach the full counsels of God.
Amen.
Perhaps they should take an oath that said we're going to stand for righteousness no matter where we have to stand. Perhaps they should take an oath and say, we're going to resist tyrants and we're going to resist evil. It doesn't matter if that evil person is made to be an elected citizen. Evil is evil no matter where you find it. And no matter where it is, we have an obligation before God to resist and not bow.
Amen.
So I want to challenge preachers and call on preachers and the people of God, stop hiding behind your 501c3. Stop worshiping the almighty dollar and bow before Almighty God.
Amen.
And I want to leave this challenge not just to preachers, because I don't know how many are here, but I know we're here. And maybe there's some believers out here. Maybe there's some churchgoers out here. I want to challenge you. I believe that the church in America needs a new exodus.
Amen.
We need a new exodus of God's people. If that man who's calling himself a shepherd is too cowardly to speak on issues that matter, then you should come out.
Amen, brother.
If that so-called pastor loves his wallet more than he loves God, you should come out.
Amen.
If that preacher is too scared claiming we don't need to offend anybody because we'll offend those that we're trying to reach. Those that you're trying to reach are being oppressed by evil, and they see people calling themselves Christians standing by and doing nothing. What sort of testimony to the principles of God is that? What sort of gospel testimony is that?
That's good.
And if your preacher, so-called, is too scared to stand up for what's right and too scared to preach out, I say come out from among them and be ye separate.
Amen.
We need a revival in this nation of truth. We need a revival in this nation of liberty. And I'm going to tell you this one thing as I've traveled and hear people talk about this issue and put it into a political context of right versus left and Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative. And I hear we need more conservatives. I see a lot of people calling themselves conservatives. I believe what we need, more than we need conservatives, is we need people who are courageous.
Amen.
We don't need a revival of conservatism. We need a revival of courage. It's time for people to stand up and be counted. I believe as God told Esther, He sent us into the kingdom, and let's face it, that's what we've become. He sent us into the kingdom for such a time as this. And I believe for the purpose of transforming this fundamentally transformed kingdom back into the constitutional republic that God enabled our founders to give to us. And I think it's time for God's people and God's preachers to stand up and defend the gifts of liberty and be good stewards for that. Let's have an American exodus. Let's find people who are standing for truth, who are standing for liberty, and let's leave these cowardly idolaters standing in these false pulpits by themselves. And I think I'm supposed to introduce you to my beautiful wife. And she taught me how to give these good speeches. But I have the privilege of being married to KrisAnne Hall. I don't know how many are familiar with, but KrisAnne is a constitutional attorney. She's a former prosecutor that was fired for teaching the Constitution on her own time. Welcome to a fundamentally transformed America. And now, ever since then, her left-wing radical boss said, you can either teach the Constitution or you can work for me. And I'm so proud of this lady who stood and said, you know what, you did not give me my rights, and I'm not going to surrender them to you for a paycheck. And now she travels the Constitution teaching it all over the United States. I've been teaching for the last 5 years to teach about 265 groups in 22 states last year alone. Well, just about every year we've averaged that. And by the grace of God, we're going to continue doing that. And as she has said before, this is not a fame ministry, this is a faith ministry. And we believe that God has intended for America for a revival of liberty, and come what may, we want to be on His side.